Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
August 1961. My name is Margot Schneider, and I have lived in this flat for 43 years. The building is older than that, built in the 1920s with thick walls that hold sounds like secrets. Today, as I sit here in my kitchen with the morning light filtering through curtains I've mended more times than I can count, I can still remember the morning our street changed its name. It was August 1961, and I was 25 then, newly married to Klaus. We had been living here for just 2 months, still arranging furniture and learning which floorboards creaked. The flat was a gift from Klaus's father, who worked for the Municipal Housing Authority. 3 rooms, a kitchen, a sitting room, and a bedroom. The walls were painted a pale green that reminded me of hospital corridors, but we were grateful. Housing was scarce, and young couples waited years for their own place. I remember waking that morning to the sound of hammering, not the gentle tap-tap of someone hanging a picture, but the methodical pounding of official work. Klaus was already at the window, still in his undershirt, peering down at the street through our thin curtains. "They're changing the street signs," he said quietly. I joined him at the window. Below, 2 men in grey coveralls were removing the old sign, Friedrichstraße, it had been called then, after some long-dead Prussian prince. One of the men held a new sign, freshly painted in crisp black letters, Karl-Marx Street. "Well," I said, pulling my robe tighter, "I suppose that's that." Klaus nodded, but I could see the small line that appeared between his eyebrows when he was thinking. He was always thinking in those days, my Klaus, always weighing words before he spoke them, even to me. The men worked efficiently, methodically. They had done this before, I realized. Street by street, the city was being renamed, reshaped, made new. Later, I would learn that hundreds of streets had changed that summer. Kaiser-Wilhelm-Straße became Unter den Linden again. Hindenburgdamm became Otto-Grotewohl-Straße. The geography of memory was being redrawn with each new sign. "I'll still think of it as Friedrichstraße," I whispered to Klaus as we watched. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, fear perhaps, or caution. "We should get used to the new name," he said gently. "It's Karl-Marx Street now." That was the first lesson I learned about living here. Adaptation was survival, and survival was adaptation. We learned to say Karl-Marx Street when we gave our address. We learned to nod approvingly when neighbors mentioned the wisdom of honoring the great socialist thinker. We learned that some thoughts were for sharing and others were for keeping. But in the privacy of our own minds, in the space between heartbeats, some of us still remembered Friedrichstraße. 2 weeks later, we woke to different hammering. This time, it wasn't street signs being changed. It was something much larger, much more permanent. Klaus shook me awake at dawn, his hand on my shoulder, gentle but insistent. "Margot," he whispered, "come to the window." Quickly I padded across the cold floor, my bare feet finding the familiar path around our small table, past the chair where Klaus left his clothes each night. At the window, I pressed my face to the glass and looked toward the sector border, just 2 streets away. Men were working there too, but these weren't municipal workers changing signs. These were soldiers, construction workers, officials with clipboards. They were building something. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "A wall," Klaus said simply. We stood there in our night clothes, watching our city divide itself. The work was urgent, purposeful. Concrete blocks appeared as if from nowhere. Rolls of barbed wire glinted in the early morning sun. By afternoon, what had been a street you could cross with a casual step had become a barrier. That evening, we listened to the radio with Frau Weber from across the hall. She was a widow in her 50s who always smelled of lavender soap and anxiety. Her son Hans had been studying in West Berlin and was supposed to visit that weekend. Temporarily, the radio announcer said in his crisp official voice, to protect the citizens of the German Democratic Republic from fascist provocateurs and ensure the continued progress of socialist construction. Frau Weber said nothing, but I watched her hands as they folded and refolded her handkerchief. Neat, precise creases over and over again. Hans never came for that weekend visit, or the next, or the one after that. In our flat that night, Klaus and I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the building settling around us. The elderly couple upstairs walking their small circuit from bedroom to kitchen and back. The young man below us, practicing violin scales, the same progression of notes he played every evening, the familiar sounds that made a place feel like home. "Do you think it really is temporary?" I asked Klaus in the darkness. He was quiet for so long I thought he had fallen asleep. Then he said, "I think we should learn to live as if it isn't." The next morning, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Or perhaps I had seen it but hadn't understood its significance. There was a small mirror positioned on our neighbor's windowsill across the courtyard, angled to reflect the street below. From her kitchen window, Frau Müller could see who came and went from our building without being seen herself. I mentioned this to Klaus over breakfast. Black bread with margarine and a thin slice of cheese, our usual meal. "Many people are being careful now," he said, not looking up from his newspaper. "Careful of what?" He folded the paper precisely, the way he did everything, careful of being misunderstood. That afternoon, I walked to the local grocery store to buy potatoes and encountered my first lesson in the new reality. The shopkeeper, Herr Brenner, whom I had known since childhood, greeted me with unusual formality. "Good afternoon, Citizen Schneider," he said, emphasizing the word citizen in a way that felt rehearsed. Behind him, I noticed a small photograph on the wall that hadn't been there the week before, the party leaders looking stern and benevolent simultaneously. Below it, a small sign, "Building Socialism Together." As Herr Brenner weighed my potatoes, I mentioned that I had enjoyed the music from the radio show the night before, a program of folk songs that had always been my favorite. "Yes," he agreed carefully, "the folk music of the working people is very educational." Educational. I filed that word away, another small adjustment to make. Entertainment was educational. Work was fulfilling. The wall was temporary. Walking home with my string bag of potatoes, I passed the street where the wall was growing higher each day. Workers moved with mechanical efficiency, adding layer upon layer of concrete and wire. Some of them looked like they might be my age, young men who might have gone to school with Klaus or danced at the same neighborhood festivals where we had met. I wondered what they thought about as they built, whether they believed in the work they were doing or whether they simply needed the job, whether they understood that they were not just building a wall but changing the shape of thousands of lives, including their own. That evening, Klaus came home with news from his workplace, a small factory that produced electrical components for radios and televisions. There would be new production quotas, he said, new efficiency targets, new opportunities for workers to demonstrate their commitment to socialist progress. Opportunities, I repeated, tasting the word. Yes, Klaus said, loosening his tie. Opportunities. We were learning a new language, my husband and I. A language where words carried extra weight, where meaning lived in the spaces between what was said and what was understood. It was a language of survival, disguised as enthusiasm, of private thoughts wrapped in public phrases. Over dinner that night, potato soup with a small piece of sausage stretched to last 2 meals, Klaus told me about his conversation with the factory supervisor. Herr Klein asked about our living situation, Klaus said, stirring his soup slowly, whether we were comfortable here, whether we had everything we needed. What did you tell him? I told him we were very grateful for the flat and that we looked forward to contributing to the community here. I nodded, understanding. These weren't just casual questions. They were assessments, evaluations. We were being measured against some invisible standard of appropriate gratitude and civic commitment. After dinner, I washed our dishes in the small sink while Klaus read the evening paper. The water was lukewarm. The building's hot water was unreliable, but I found the ritual soothing, the simple, repetitive motion of cleaning, of setting things in order. From the window above the sink, I could see into other apartments across the courtyard. Frau Weber sitting at her table, writing letters that would never be sent. The Kowalski family having their evening meal, the children sitting straight-backed and quiet. Herr Richter listening to his radio while darning socks, the same careful stitches he made every night. All of us living our separate lives in our separate boxes, connected by thin walls and shared silence. Before bed, I helped Klaus prepare his clothes for the next day. His good shirt, pressed and hung carefully. His shoes polished until they reflected the overhead light. His party pin, small and neat, positioned precisely on his jacket lapel. "When did you get that?" I asked, touching the pin lightly. "Last week," he said. Herr Klein suggested it would be appropriate. Another word to add to our growing vocabulary, appropriate, like educational and grateful and temporary. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Klaus's steady breathing beside me, I thought about the street sign that had been changed that morning. How quickly Friedrichstraße had become Karl-Marx Street, how easily one identity could be replaced with another. I wondered if it was the same for people. Left for the factory each morning at 7:15, his footsteps joining the chorus of other men's footsteps on the stairs, all heading to their assigned contributions to the socialist future. I had found work teaching at the local primary school, where I spent my days helping 8-year-olds learn their letters and numbers, and also how to be good citizens of the German Democratic Republic. The children were bright and eager, their faces unmarked by the careful expressions their parents wore. They asked questions with the fearless curiosity of the young. Why can't we visit the other side of the city? Why do some people speak in whispers? Why does Frau Teacher look sad sometimes when she thinks no one is watching? Because, I learned to answer, we must focus on building our life here, on being grateful for what we have. The children would nod solemnly, and I wondered what they would remember of these conversations when they were my age. Our flat had evolved too, accumulating the small improvements that marked the passage of years. Klaus had built shelves for our books, carefully selected volumes of approved literature mixed with practical guides to housekeeping and socialist living. I had sewn new curtains from fabric that Frau Weber had found through connections I didn't ask about. The pale green walls had been repainted a cheerful yellow. a color I had chosen from the limited palette available at the state store. We had settled into the community rhythms as well, building meetings every Tuesday evening where we discussed maintenance issues and received updates on neighborhood improvements. The annual street festival celebrating International Workers' Day, where we all contributed dishes and participated in collective singing. The voluntary but not voluntary Neighborhood Watch program, where we took turns monitoring the street for any unusual activity. It was during one of these watch periods, in the spring of 1967, that I first noticed the Kowalski boys' late-night habits. I was stationed at the building's front entrance from 10 p.m. to midnight, ostensibly watching for anything inconsistent with neighborhood security. Mostly, this meant observing the entirely normal activities of working people returning from late shifts, walking their dogs, or simply stepping out for a breath of air. But young Stefan Kowalski, who was perhaps 19 then, had begun taking very long walks at very specific times, always after his parents had gone to bed, always carrying a small canvas bag, always returning exactly 2 hours later without the bag. The responsible thing would have been to report this pattern to the neighborhood committee. The careful thing would have been to discuss it with Klaus, to seek his guidance on how to handle such a delicate situation. Instead, I found myself doing something I hadn't expected. I began covering for him. When Frau Richter, who took the midnight to 2 shift, mentioned that she had seen irregular pedestrian activity during her watch, I suggested that perhaps she had seen the delivery trucks that serviced the bakery 2 streets over. When the committee chairman asked if anyone had observed suspicious individual movement patterns, I spoke enthusiastically about the increased number of citizens taking evening constitutional walks, which surely demonstrated improved public health and civic engagement. I told myself I was simply avoiding unnecessary complications, but the truth was more complex than that. In young Stefan's furtive purposefulness, I recognized something I had almost forgotten, the possibility of choice, even when choices seemed impossible. Months passed before I understood what Stefan was actually doing. It was Klaus who inadvertently provided the explanation through a conversation he overheard at the factory. Young Kowalski got a letter from relatives in Bavaria, Klaus mentioned over dinner one evening. Apparently they've been asking for family photographs, news about life here. I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. Stefan's late-night walks, the small canvas bag, the 2-hour absences. He was finding ways to send letters across the border, probably through intermediaries who had access to diplomatic pouches or business connections in the West. That's nice, I said carefully. Family connections are important. Klaus nodded, but I could see he was thinking, of course, one must be cautious about what information leaves the country. Some details about our life here might be misunderstood by those who don't understand the progress we're making. Translation. Stefan Kowalski was walking a very dangerous line. That night, as I prepared for my neighborhood watch shift, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. When Stefan appeared at his usual time, carrying his usual bag, I stepped out of the shadows near the building entrance. "Good evening, Stefan," I said quietly. He froze, his face cycling through fear, defiance, and resignation in rapid succession. "Frau Schneider," he said finally, "I was just taking a walk." "Yes," I agreed, "it's a nice evening for walking. The air is particularly clear tonight." We stood in silence for a moment, both understanding that this conversation was happening in the space between official reality and private truth. "I've been thinking," I said eventually, "that if someone were to take regular evening walks, it might be wise to vary the route occasionally, and perhaps to carry different items, a book maybe, or a thermos of tea. The appearance of routine can sometimes draw unwanted attention." Stefan looked at me with the sharp intelligence I had always admired in young people. "Thank you, Frau Schneider," he said. "That's very practical advice." "I'm a teacher," I replied. "Practical advice is my specialty." He nodded and continued on his walk, but his posture had changed, less furtive, more casual. The posture of someone out for a constitutional stroll rather than someone on a covert mission. From that night forward, Stefan varied his patterns. Sometimes he carried a book and read under streetlights. Sometimes he brought a thermos and paused to sit on benches. Sometimes he met other young people and they walked together, laughing and talking about ordinary things, their jobs, their families, their hopes for better weather. And sometimes, seamlessly woven into these innocent activities, small packages were transferred, letters were exchanged, and connections across the divide were maintained. I never asked for details, and Stefan never offered them, but occasionally over the following months I would find small gifts outside our door, a Western chocolate bar, a fashion magazine, once even a letter from my cousin in Munich, whom I hadn't heard from since the wall went up. These gifts told me that Stefan's network was working, that some channels of communication remained open despite the barriers. They also told me that my small act of protective blindness had been noticed and appreciated. Klaus never knew about any of this, and I was careful to keep it that way, not because I didn't trust him, but because knowledge could be dangerous and ignorance could be protection. In our world, there were things it was safer not to know, questions it was wiser not to ask. But late at night, when I lay awake listening to the sounds of the building around us, I would think about Stefan's letters and the family members who received them. I would imagine their relief at hearing that we were alive, that we were managing, that love persisted even when separated by concrete and wire. These thoughts made me feel less alone in my small bed, in my small flat on Karl-Marx Street. They reminded me that walls, however high and strong, could not completely sever the connections that mattered most. In 1968, the rhythm of our careful days was interrupted by news from Prague. The radio spoke of fraternal assistance being provided to Czechoslovakia, of counter-revolutionary elements being neutralized for the good of socialist progress. But the news was sparse, and what little information we received felt sanitized, stripped of the human details that would help us understand what was really happening to our neighbors to the south. It was Klaus who brought home the fuller story, whispered during a break in the factory's noise. A colleague had a brother-in-law in Prague who had managed to send word through carefully coded letters. The reality was messier and more frightening than the official accounts suggested. That evening, as we listened to the state radio's coverage of the Prague situation, Klaus and I sat closer together on our small sofa than was usual. Without discussing it, we both understood that events beyond our control were reshaping the landscape we had learned to navigate. "Do you think," I asked quietly during a pause in the broadcast, "that what happened there could happen here?" Klaus was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I think what happened there is happening here." Just more slowly, I understood what he meant. The same forces that had prompted intervention in Prague were already at work in our daily lives. The gradual tightening of acceptable thought, the increasing sophistication of observation and control, the patient, methodical elimination of alternatives. But understanding this didn't make it easier to live with. If anything, it made our careful daily routines feel more precious and more fragile. Each morning's normalcy became a small gift, each evening's predictability a minor miracle. Winter that year seemed longer than usual. Perhaps it was just the weather, or perhaps it was the way the Prague events had reminded us all how little control we had over the larger forces shaping our lives. The heating in our building was inconsistent, and we spent many evenings huddled together under blankets, playing cards, or reading by lamplight to conserve electricity. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Klaus surprised me with an announcement. "I've been thinking," he said, looking up from the book he was reading, "that we should consider starting a family." I set down my own book, a novel about socialist agricultural progress that was making me sleepy, and looked at him carefully. We had discussed children before in the abstract way that young couples do, but always as a future possibility rather than an immediate plan. "Now?" I asked. "Why not now?" he replied. "We have the flat, we have steady work, we're settled." Settled. Another word that carried multiple meanings in our vocabulary. Settled could mean stable, established, ready for the next phase of life, but it could also mean resigned, accepting, prepared to make the best of circumstances we couldn't change. "What made you think of it tonight?" I asked. Klaus was quiet for a moment, then he closed his book and set it aside. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that I've been thinking about Prague, about how quickly things can change, how little we can control. And I realized that if we're going to have a family, if we're going to create something good in this world, we should do it while we can." I reached for his hand across the small space between our chairs. His fingers were cold from the inadequate heating, but his grip was warm and steady. "Yes," I said, "let's try." Our daughter Anna was born in October 1969, during the week of the 20th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic. The hospital was decorated with banners celebrating 2 decades of socialist achievement, and the nurses spoke enthusiastically about how fortunate Anna was to be born into such a progressive society. I held my daughter in the narrow hospital bed and looked into her dark eyes, Klaus's eyes, and felt a mixture of love and terror that I had never experienced before. Love for this tiny, perfect person who had somehow grown from my hopes and Klaus's dreams. Terror at the thought of raising her in a world where so many words had double meanings, where so many truths had to be kept private. "She's beautiful," Klaus whispered, touching Anna's tiny fist with one finger. "She's ours," I whispered back, and in that moment that felt like the most important truth of all. Having a child changed everything and nothing. Anna grew from a wrinkled newborn into a curious toddler against the backdrop of our carefully maintained routines, her development marking time in a way that felt both personal and universal. She took her first steps across the yellow linoleum of our kitchen floor. She spoke her first word, "Mama," while sitting in her high chair, watching me prepare our evening meal of potato soup and dark bread. But Anna's presence also made the contradictions of our life more acute. How do you explain to a 3-year-old why she can't visit the playground that she can see from her bedroom window, the one that happens to be on the other side of the wall? How do you answer when she asks why some people speak quietly and others speak loudly, why some books are kept on high shelves and others are left within reach? Because, I learn to say, there are different rules for different places, and we follow the rules that keep us safe. Anna would nod with the serious expression of a child trying to understand adult logic, but I could see the questions multiplying behind her eyes. She was Klaus's daughter in that way, always thinking, always weighing what she observed against what she was told. Klaus had been promoted at the factory, a recognition of his steady productivity and appropriate civic engagement. The promotion came with a larger office, a small increase in salary, and new responsibilities that he described carefully when asked. "I'm helping to coordinate efficiency improvements," he would say, "making sure our production goals align with the broader economic plan." What this meant in practice, I gradually understood, was that Klaus now spent part of his time in meetings where workers' performance was evaluated not just for technical competence, but for ideological reliability. He came home from these meetings with a particular kind of tiredness, the exhaustion of someone who had spent hours parsing the difference between what was said and what was meant. Weber in Assembly Line 3 has been asking too many questions about overtime policies, Klaus might mention over dinner. What kind of questions, I would ask? The kind that suggest he doesn't understand how voluntary our extra efforts should be. Translation. Weber was complaining about unpaid overtime, and Klaus was being asked to monitor whether this complaint reflected a deeper problem with Weber's attitude toward collective responsibility. These conversations made me grateful for my work at the school, where the moral complexities were different, but perhaps clearer. Children, I had learned, were remarkably adaptable to contradictory realities. They could learn to give the expected answers about socialist progress while privately maintaining their own observations about the world around them. My students had learned, for instance, that essays about their families should emphasize themes of collective progress and shared sacrifice. But in their artwork, drawings that were less subject to explicit evaluation, they revealed more complex truths. They drew their fathers looking tired. They drew their mothers standing at windows looking out. They drew buildings that were grey and streets that were empty. "Tell me about this picture, Greta," I might say to a 7-year-old who had drawn her family standing very straight and still, like soldiers. "That's how we stand for the photograph that goes in Papa's workplace file," Greta would explain matter-of-factly. "Mama says it's important that we look proud." I would nod and praise Greta's careful attention to detail while filing away another small observation about how early children learn to distinguish between private truth and public performance. Anna was 4 when she made her first such distinction. We were walking home from the market where I had stood in line for an hour to buy oranges, a rare treat that had appeared unexpectedly. Anna was excited about the oranges, chattering about how we would share them with Papa when he came home from work. As we turned onto our street, we encountered Herr Klein, Klaus's supervisor from the factory. He was with his wife, a thin woman who always dressed as if she were attending an important meeting. "Good afternoon, Frau Schneider," Herr Klein said, with the formal friendliness that marked all our neighborhood interactions. "And this must be little Anna." Anna, who was normally shy with strangers, looked up at Herr Klein with unusual directness. "Hello?" she said politely. Then, with the innocent honesty of a 4-year-old, she added, Mama waited a very long time for oranges today. She said the supply coordination could be better. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and alarm. Criticism of supply coordination, even from the mouth of a child, could be interpreted as criticism of economic planning, which could be interpreted as insufficient appreciation for socialist progress. But Herr Klein surprised me by laughing. Children notice everything, don't they? He said genially. Anna, you should tell your mama that patience is a virtue, especially when it comes to seasonal fruits. Anna nodded seriously. I will tell her, she promised. As Herr Klein and his wife continued down the street, I knelt to Anna's level and took her hands in mine. Anna, I said gently, when we talk to neighbors about things like waiting in lines, it's better to say that we're grateful for the opportunity to buy special treats like oranges. Can you remember that? Anna looked at me with the concentrated attention she gave to difficult problems. Because Herr Klein might not understand that you were just tired, not ungrateful. Exactly, I said, impressed by her quick comprehension. Like when I tell Oma Weber that her soup is delicious even when it tastes like water. I paused, considering this comparison. Frau Weber, whose loneliness had grown more pronounced since her son's inability to visit from the West, often invited us for meals that reflected her limited cooking skills and even more limited food budget. Yes, I said finally. Sometimes we say kind things to protect people's feelings. Anna nodded. And sometimes we say kind things to protect our own feelings too. That evening, I told Klaus about the encounter with Herr Klein, expecting him to be concerned about Anna's unguarded comment. Instead, he seemed more interested in her quick understanding of the correction. She's learning to read situations, he said with what sounded like approval. That's good. That will serve her well. I felt a pang of sadness at this assessment. Klaus was right, of course. The ability to read situations, to understand the multiple layers of meaning in social interactions was indeed a valuable skill in our world. But I mourned the loss of the unguarded honesty that had prompted Anna's original comment about the oranges. Later that night, after Anna was asleep in her small bed in the corner of our bedroom, Klaus and I lay talking in whispers about her development. Do you think, I asked, that we're teaching her to be dishonest? Klaus was quiet for a long moment. I think, he said finally, that we're teaching her to be safe. And that honesty is a luxury that not everyone can afford. But she's so young. Old enough to remember what she learns now, Klaus replied. Old enough to understand that different situations call for different kinds of truth. I wanted to argue with this logic, but I couldn't find a flaw in it. Anna was indeed old enough to remember, and the lessons she learned now about navigating social complexity would shape her understanding of the world for years to come. Over the following months, I watched Anna integrate these lessons with the natural adaptability of childhood. She learned to modulate her voice when discussing certain topics, to pause before answering direct questions, to read the expressions of the adults around her for clues about appropriate responses, but she also retained her essential curiosity and warmth. She still asked questions, just more carefully. She still expressed opinions, just more selectively. She still reached out for connection with others, just with a more sophisticated understanding of the risks and boundaries involved. By 1973, Anna had started kindergarten, where she encountered her first formal education in civic responsibility. She came home each day with new songs about friendship between nations, new stories about the heroic workers who built our socialist society, new games that emphasized cooperation over competition. Today we played Building the Future, Anna announced one afternoon, settling at our kitchen table with the serious air of someone reporting important news. I was a factory worker and Max was a farmer, and we had to work together to make enough food and products for everyone. That sounds like a good game, I replied, setting a cup of milk and a slice of bread with jam in front of her. Did you and Max work well together? Yes, Anna said, then paused thoughtfully. But Petra wanted to be a doctor, and Frau Müller said that wasn't part of the game today. Petra got sad. I sat down across from Anna, recognizing an opportunity for one of those conversations that had become increasingly important in our household. What do you think about that? I asked. Anna considered this question with the seriousness she brought to all moral problems. I think Petra would be a good doctor, she said finally. She's very careful with hurt animals, and she always knows what to do when someone is crying. Those are good qualities for a doctor, I agreed. But maybe, Anna continued, working through the logic, Frau Müller was right that the game needed farmers and factory workers more than doctors that day, and maybe Petra can be a doctor in a different game. I nodded, impressed by Anna's ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. She had learned to acknowledge the authority of the teacher while maintaining her own assessment of her friend's capabilities. She had learned to accept limitation without giving up hope for alternative possibilities. These were sophisticated lessons for a 5-year-old, but they were the lessons that life in our world required. That winter brought news that affected our family directly. Klaus's factory was being expanded with new production lines and increased quotas that reflected the growing importance of electronic components in the socialist economy. Along with expansion came new opportunities for advancement and new requirements for political education. I've been selected for a leadership development program, Klaus announced one evening, his tone carefully neutral. That's good, I ventured, reading his expression for clues. It's an honor, Klaus said, and an opportunity to contribute more effectively to our collective progress. Translation. Klaus's technical competence and political reliability had earned him a chance for promotion, but the promotion would require deeper involvement in the ideological aspects of workplace management. The program met 3 evenings a week for 2 months, covering topics like Marxist-Leninist principles in industrial organization and leadership in socialist work collectives. Klaus would come home from these sessions with handouts and reading assignments, documents filled with dense theoretical language about economic planning and worker consciousness. What are they actually teaching you? I asked one night as Klaus spread his materials across our kitchen table. How to identify and address productivity problems that stem from ideological confusion, Klaus said, reading directly from one of his handouts. And what does that mean in practice? Klaus looked up from the paper and met my eyes. It means learning to recognize when someone's poor performance might reflect insufficient commitment to collective goals rather than just technical difficulties. I felt a chill of understanding. Klaus was being trained to evaluate not just what his colleagues produced, but how they thought about what they produced. He was being prepared to identify and report on the political attitudes of the men and women he supervised. Do you think you'll be good at that? I asked carefully. Klaus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I think I'll be as good at it as I need to be. After Klaus completed the program and received his promotion, our life settled into a new pattern. He left for work earlier and came home later, carrying the additional responsibilities of his expanded role. He attended more meetings, filed more reports, and spoke with increasing frequency about the importance of maintaining productive workplace morale. But I also noticed changes in Klaus himself. He was more careful about what he said, even to me. He was more attentive to political developments reported in the newspaper. He began listening to the radio news with a concentration that suggested professional rather than personal interest. One evening, as I was helping Anna with her reading homework, Klaus interrupted us with an unusual question. "Anna," he said, sitting down at our table, "what do your friends at school say about their families? Do they talk about their parents' work?" Anna looked up from her picture book, a story about a little girl who helps her grandmother in a collective farm, and considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she said, "Max says his papa makes very important radio parts, and Greta says her mama teaches other mamas how to sew properly, and Petra says her papa knows a lot about making sure people follow the rules." I glanced at Klaus, recognizing the significance of these casual childhood reports. Anna's friends were unconsciously reflecting their parents' increasing involvement in various forms of social monitoring and control. "Do they ever say anything about whether their parents are happy with their work?" Klaus asked. Anna thought about this. "They say their parents are proud to contribute," she replied. "Just like you and Mama." Klaus nodded approvingly. "That's good. That's the right way to think about work." Later, after Anna was in bed, I asked Klaus about the purpose of his questions. "I'm trying to understand how well the children are learning appropriate attitudes," Klaus said carefully. "Their conversations can be instructive about family dynamics." I felt another chill of understanding. Klaus wasn't just monitoring his adult colleagues anymore. He was being asked to gather information about entire families through the innocent reports of their children. "And Anna's answers?" I asked. "Were exactly what they should be," Klaus replied, "which is good for everyone." That night, lying in bed listening to the familiar sounds of our building settling around us, I tried to calculate how many small compromises had brought us to this point. Klaus monitoring his colleagues, me teaching children to give expected answers, Anna learning to read situations before she could read chapter books. Each compromise had seemed reasonable at the time, even necessary. Each had been a small adjustment to changing circumstances, a practical response to the realities of our world. But somehow accumulated over years, these small compromises had transformed us into people we hadn't planned to become. The thought kept me awake long after Klaus's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. By 1975, Anna was 6 and had developed what I recognized as her own survival strategies. She had learned to be popular with her teachers through a combination of genuine intelligence and careful attention to what they wanted to hear. She had learned to maintain friendships with her classmates while avoiding the kind of intimate confidences that might later be repeated inappropriately. She had learned to ask questions that sounded curious rather than skeptical. In short, she had learned to be a successful child in our world, and I was proud of her adaptability, even as I mourned the innocence that such adaptability required her to surrender. That autumn brought an incident that tested all of our accumulated skills in navigation. Anna came home from school one day with news that initially seemed routine. her class was participating in a project to write letters to children in other socialist countries as part of an international friendship initiative. "I'm writing to a girl named Katya in Moscow," Anna announced, spreading her school supplies across our kitchen table. "I have to tell her about our life here, and she'll tell me about her life there." "That sounds wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased. "What will you tell her?" Anna had already given this considerable thought. "I'll tell her about our flat, and about Papa's important work at the factory, and about how I'm learning to read and write. And I'll ask her about Russian snow, because Max says it's different from German snow." I helped Anna draft her letter, a cheerful account of a 7-year-old's daily life that emphasized family harmony and educational progress. Anna wrote about her favorite subjects in school, her friendship with her classmates, and her excitement about learning new skills that would help her contribute to society when she grew up. It was a perfectly appropriate letter, the kind that would reflect well on Anna, her family, and her school. But as I watched her copy the final version in her careful handwriting, I felt a familiar sadness about the distance between the letter's cheerful certainty and the more complex reality of our actual lives. 3 weeks later, Anna received a reply from Katya, a letter that had been translated from Russian by school officials. Katya wrote about her life in Moscow with the same cheerful certainty that Anna had employed, describing her studies, her family, and her hopes for continued friendship between their countries. But Anna, reading the letter aloud to Klaus and me over dinner, paused at one paragraph and looked up with a puzzled expression. "Katya says she hopes to visit Germany someday to see our beautiful cities and meet our happy people," Anna read. "But why would she need to hope? Can't she just come visit?" Klaus and I exchanged glances across the table. This was the kind of question that required careful handling, the kind that could lead to increasingly difficult follow-up questions. "Travel between countries is complicated," Klaus said finally. "There are many arrangements that have to be made, many permissions that have to be obtained." "Like when we wanted to visit Oma's sister in Bavaria, but we couldn't get the papers?" Anna asked. Another glance between Klaus and me. Anna's memory was excellent, and she had indeed overheard discussions about my failed attempts to arrange a visit to my aunt in the West. "Yes," I said, "like that. Sometimes the arrangements are very difficult to make." Anna nodded, accepting this explanation with the practiced resignation of a child who had learned that many adult answers ended with references to complicated arrangements and difficult procedures. But that evening, after Anna was in bed, Klaus brought up the incident again. "She's starting to ask more sophisticated questions," he observed. "She's getting older," I replied. "It's natural." "Yes, but we need to be careful about how we handle them." The wrong kind of curiosity could create problems. I knew Klaus was right, but the conversation made me feel tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. We were discussing our daughter's intellectual development as if it were a security risk, evaluating her natural curiosity as if it were a potential threat. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "I think we should be more proactive about shaping her understanding," Klaus said. "Rather than just responding to her questions, we should anticipate them and provide appropriate context." Over the following weeks, Klaus and I began having what we privately called educational conversations with Anna. We talked about the importance of patience in international relations, about the complex historical factors that shape travel policies, about the wisdom of focusing on local friendships and opportunities rather than dwelling on distant possibilities. Anna listened to these conversations with the same serious attention she brought to her school lessons, nodding at appropriate moments and asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her comprehension. But I noticed that she had also begun having different kinds of conversations with her toys. Playing alone in her corner of our bedroom, she would create elaborate scenarios where her dolls traveled freely between imaginary countries, visiting relatives and making new friends without any reference to complicated arrangements or difficult procedures. These private play sessions told me that Anna was developing her own methods for managing the contradictions in her world. She was learning to accept official explanations while maintaining space for alternative possibilities to follow rules while preserving dreams. It was a sophisticated form of adaptation, and I recognized it as a survival skill that would serve her well in the years ahead. But it also represented another small loss, another piece of childhood innocence sacrificed to the requirements of our reality. By 1978, Klaus had been promoted again, this time to a position that carried the title Deputy Director of Human Resources Development. The promotion came with a larger salary, access to better housing, and responsibilities that he described in increasingly abstract terms. I'm helping to optimize workforce alignment with production objectives, he would say when asked about his work. What this meant in practice, I understood from fragments of conversation and careful observation, was that Klaus now played a significant role in determining which workers received promotions, which were assigned to less desirable positions, and which were recommended for additional political education. He had become, in effect, one of the people who decided other people's fates based on assessments of their political reliability as much as their professional competence. The promotion qualified us for a larger apartment in a newer building, a 2-bedroom flat with more modern fixtures and better heating. But Klaus surprised me by declining the opportunity. "I think we're comfortable here," he said when I asked about his decision. "This building has become home." I suspected his real reason was different, that moving would require new assessments, new introductions, new relationships to navigate. Here on Karl-Marx Street, in our familiar building with our known neighbors, Klaus understood the social dynamics. He knew which relationships were safe, which required caution, and which were best avoided entirely. Starting over in a new building would mean starting over with the careful work of social positioning that had taken years to establish. Besides, Klaus added, Anna is settled in her school, and stability is important for children. This was true, but it was also another example of how our choices had become constrained by considerations that had nothing to do with our actual preferences. We were staying in our small flat, not because we loved it, but because moving seemed too risky. That autumn, Anna started 2nd grade with a new teacher, Frau Hoffmann, who had a reputation for innovative approaches to civic education. Anna came home from her first week of school with new enthusiasm for a project that initially seemed harmless, creating a family tree that would illustrate how each student's family contributed to the broader community. "I have to draw our family," Anna explained, spreading paper and colored pencils across our kitchen table, and then show how Papa's work at the factory connects to other families, and how your work at the school connects to other families, and how we're all part of the same big family of socialist progress. I watched Anna work on her project, drawing careful representations of Klaus in his office, me in my classroom, and herself at her school desk. Around these central figures, she drew connecting lines to other families, other workers, other contributors to the collective effort. It was a charming exercise in social awareness, and Anna approached it with the same conscientiousness she brought to all her schoolwork. But as I watched her draw, I realized that she was also creating a detailed map of social relationships that could be used for purposes beyond artistic expression. The Family Tree Project would tell Frau Hoffmann which families were connected to which others, which parents held, which positions, which children might have access to which kinds of information. In the hands of a teacher who understood the broader purposes of such information, Anna's innocent artwork could become a tool for social monitoring. That evening, I mentioned the project to Klaus, expecting him to share my concerns. Instead, he seemed pleased. That's exactly the kind of assignment that helps children understand their place in the larger community, he said. Anna will benefit from thinking systematically about these connections. I realized that Klaus's new position had given him a different perspective on such exercises. From his point of view, the Family Tree Project was a useful tool for developing appropriate social consciousness in children. The fact that it also served surveillance purposes was perhaps not a drawback, but an additional benefit. This realization marked another moment of adjustment in my understanding of our life. Klaus wasn't just adapting to the requirements of his position, he was beginning to internalize them, to see them as legitimate rather than merely necessary. The distance between us, which had been growing gradually over the years, suddenly felt wider and more significant. Anna was 10 when she stopped asking certain kinds of questions. Not all questions. She remained curious about mathematics, fascinated by stories, eager to understand how things worked. But the questions about why some things were the way they were, about whether things could be different, about what lay beyond the boundaries of our carefully circumscribed world, those questions simply ceased. I noticed the change gradually, the way you notice a sound disappearing only when you realize you no longer hear it. Anna had developed what I recognized as a mature understanding of which curiosities were safe to express and which were better kept private. This development coincided with her enrollment in the Young Pioneers, the youth organization that provided structured activities and ideological education for children between 10 and 14. Anna came home from her first meeting with a red neckerchief and a handbook of songs and pledges that emphasized collective responsibility and socialist values. We learned about the importance of friendship between peoples, Anna reported over dinner, unconsciously echoing the formal language of her new organization, and about how young people can contribute to building a better future. That sounds very educational, Klaus said approvingly. Anna nodded seriously. Frau Schmidt says that young pioneers learn to be leaders by following good examples and setting good examples for others. I recognized the circular logic that characterized much of the political education in our world. Leadership through following, freedom through discipline, individuality through conformity. Anna had learned to navigate these contradictions with the same skill she applied to mathematics problems or grammar exercises. But that evening, as I helped Anna prepare her school clothes for the next day, she surprised me with a question that suggested her understanding was more nuanced than her public statements indicated. "Mama," she said quietly, Do you think everyone really believes the things they say in Young Pioneers meetings? I paused in my folding of her school dress, considering how to respond. This was exactly the kind of question that Anna had stopped asking in public, but she was still asking in private, which meant that her intellectual curiosity remained intact, even as her public expression of it had become more circumspect. "What do you think?" I asked, employing the teacher's technique of answering a question with a question. Anna was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think some people believe everything, and some people believe some things, and some people just know what they're supposed to say." "And which are you?" I asked. "I think I'm the kind who knows what I'm supposed to say," Anna replied with the matter-of-fact tone she used for stating obvious facts. "But I still think about other things in my head." I hugged her then, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in her intelligence and adaptability, sadness that such adaptability was necessary for a 10-year-old child. "That's very wise," I told her, "and it's perfectly normal to have private thoughts that are different from the things you say in public." "Like you and Papa?" Anna asked. I hesitated, then decided that honesty was the appropriate response. "Yes," I said, "like Papa and me." This conversation marked a new phase in our family relationships. Anna had crossed the threshold from unconscious adaptation to conscious strategy. She now understood that we were all managing multiple levels of reality simultaneously, and that success in our world required skill in navigating between them. Over the following months, I watched Anna apply this understanding with remarkable sophistication. In Young Pioneers meetings, she was enthusiastic and engaged, contributing to discussions about international friendship and socialist progress with appropriate conviction. At home, she was more reflective, asking questions about practical matters rather than ideological ones, focusing on how things worked rather than why they were arranged as they were. But I also noticed that Anna had begun creating what I thought of as private spaces within our shared life. She kept a diary, written in a code of her own invention, where she recorded thoughts and observations that she shared with no one. She developed friendships with classmates based on shared interests in music or books rather than political activities. She began collecting small objects, interesting stones, colorful leaves, unusual buttons that had no practical purpose but pleased her aesthetically. These private spaces represented Anna's way of maintaining some autonomy within the constraints of our world. They were her method of preserving the parts of herself that didn't fit into the official categories of appropriate childhood development. Klaus, meanwhile, had continued to advance in his career, taking on responsibilities that extended beyond his original factory to include oversight of human resources optimization across multiple industrial facilities. His work now involved travel to other cities, attendance at regional conferences, and participation in policy development committees. "I'm helping to develop best practices for workforce motivation," he would say when asked about his expanding duties. What this meant in practical terms, I learned from overheard phone conversations and carefully read documents left on our kitchen table, was that Klaus was now part of a network of professionals who shared information about worker reliability, political attitudes, and potential security concerns across the industrial sector. He had become, in effect, part of the machinery of social control, and his success in this role had earned him recognition and respect within the system he served. But Klaus's professional advancement had also changed our domestic life in subtle ways. He was more careful about what he said, even to Anna and me. He was more attentive to our behavior, more conscious of how our activities might reflect on his position. He had begun to see our family life through the lens of his professional responsibilities, evaluating our conversations and choices for their potential impact on his career. This shift created a new kind of distance between us, a sense that Klaus was observing our life together as much as he was living it. The distance became more apparent during the winter of 1981, when Poland dominated the news with reports of counter-revolutionary activities and the eventual declaration of martial law. The official media presented these events as a necessary response to destabilizing influences, but the underlying tensions were impossible to ignore. Klaus came home from work each evening with updates from official briefings, carefully neutral accounts of the situation that emphasized the wisdom of preventive measures and the importance of maintaining stability. The leadership in Warsaw is taking appropriate steps to protect socialist progress, Klaus would report over dinner, his tone suggesting that he was repeating information rather than expressing personal opinion. Anna listened to these updates with the same serious attention she gave to her homework, occasionally asking clarifying questions about geography or terminology. But I noticed that she had stopped asking the kinds of questions that might reveal her own thoughts about the events. It was only when we were alone, as I helped her with her bath or tucked her into bed, that Anna would venture more personal observations. "The Polish children in the news look scared," she said one evening as I braided her hair for bed. "Many children look scared when there are big changes happening around them," I replied carefully. "Do you think children here would look scared if there were big changes here?" Anna asked. I considered this question, recognizing both its sophistication and its potential danger. "I think," I said finally, "that children everywhere feel safer when their daily routines stay the same." Anna nodded thoughtfully. "I like our routines," she said. "I like knowing what to expect." "So do I agreed, though I wasn't sure whether this was entirely true anymore. The Polish crisis gradually faded from the news, replaced by reports of industrial progress and cultural achievements that suggested a return to normal conditions. But the episode had reminded all of us how quickly normal conditions could change, how little control ordinary people had over the larger forces that shaped their lives. In the months that followed, I noticed that our neighbors had become more careful in their interactions, more formal in their conversations, more attentive to the potential implications of casual remarks. The building meetings became more structured, with prepared agendas and recorded minutes. The informal gatherings in the courtyard became less frequent and more superficial. It was as if the entire community had decided, without explicit discussion, that additional caution was warranted in all social relationships. Anna adapted to these changes with her characteristic intelligence, adjusting her behavior to match the new social climate. She became more reserved with classmates she didn't know well, more careful about the jokes she told, more attentive to the reactions of adults around her. But I also noticed that Anna had begun spending more time in solitary activities, reading, drawing, working on puzzles, playing elaborate games with her dolls that involved complex narratives and character development. She was creating rich internal worlds to compensate for the increasing constraints of her external environment. By 1983, Anna was 14 and had transitioned from Young Pioneers to the Free German Youth, the organization for adolescents that provided more sophisticated political education and opportunities for leadership development. She approached this transition with the same strategic thinking she applied to all institutional requirements. The FDJ has more interesting activities, Anna told me after her first meeting. They organize camping trips and cultural events, not just political discussions. That sounds like fun, I replied, though I was listening for what Anna wasn't saying as much as what she was. Yes, Anna agreed, and the leadership opportunities will look good on my applications for university. This was the first time Anna had mentioned university, and I realized that she was already thinking strategically about her future education and career. At 14, she was making choices based on long-term considerations about what would be required for advancement in our system. "What would you like to study?" I asked. Anna considered this question seriously. "I think mathematics," she said finally, "or maybe engineering." Something with clear answers and practical applications. I understood her reasoning. Mathematics and engineering were relatively safe fields, less subject to ideological interpretation than history or literature, more focused on technical competence than political reliability. Anna was choosing a path that would allow her to use her intelligence while minimizing the risks associated with intellectual curiosity. It was a wise choice, and I was proud of her strategic thinking. But I also felt a pang of loss for the child who had once asked questions about everything, who had been curious about the world simply because it was interesting rather than because it might serve her future goals. That autumn brought changes to my own work environment. The school had introduced new requirements for comprehensive student assessment that went beyond academic performance to include evaluation of social attitudes, family background, and potential for continued ideological development. As teachers, we were now expected to file detailed reports on each student's holistic development profile, including observations about their interactions with classmates, their responses to political education, and any concerns about their home environment that might affect their educational progress. We're helping to ensure that every child receives the support they need to reach their full potential, the principal explained during a faculty meeting dedicated to the new assessment procedures. What this meant in practice was that teachers were being asked to function as social workers, guidance counselors, and informants simultaneously. We were expected to identify children who might benefit from additional attention or intervention based on criteria that mixed educational concerns with political considerations. I found these new responsibilities profoundly uncomfortable. They required me to observe my students not just as learners, but as potential subjects for official concern, to evaluate their family circumstances for evidence of problematic attitudes or influences. But I also recognized that these requirements represented an opportunity to protect the children in my care. If I was going to file reports on their development, I could ensure that those reports emphasized their positive qualities and potential while minimizing any details that might lead to unwanted attention. I began crafting my student assessments with the same careful attention to language that Klaus used in his professional communications. I emphasized themes of steady progress, appropriate attitudes, and positive social integration. I described challenges in terms of developmental phases rather than character flaws. I focused on educational needs rather than family circumstances. In effect, I learned to write reports that satisfied the administrative requirements while protecting the children they described. But this protective strategy required constant vigilance and emotional energy. Each report had to be carefully calibrated to provide sufficient detail to demonstrate thorough assessment while avoiding the kind of specific information that might trigger additional scrutiny. By the end of the school year, I was exhausted by the effort of managing these competing obligations. I had become skilled at writing reports that said nothing while appearing to say everything, but the skill had come at a cost to my own sense of professional integrity. That summer, as I prepared for another year of comprehensive student assessment, I realized that I had crossed another threshold in my own adaptation to our world. I was no longer just teaching children while managing political requirements. I was actively participating in a system of surveillance disguised as educational support. The realization made me feel complicit in ways that I had previously managed to avoid. But it also made me more determined to use my position to protect the children in my care, to ensure that my participation in the system served their interests rather than just the system's needs. It was a complex moral position, and I wasn't sure whether it represented compromise or resistance. Perhaps it was both simultaneously, another example of the contradictory realities that defined life in our world. By 1985, Anna was 17 and had developed what I could only describe as a masterful understanding of social navigation. She excelled in her studies, particularly in mathematics and physics, while maintaining exactly the level of political engagement that suggested appropriate civic consciousness without excessive enthusiasm. She had learned to be successful without being conspicuous, committed without being zealous, intelligent without being questioning. In short, she had become perfectly adapted to our world, and I was both proud of her competence and saddened by the necessity that had created it. Anna's success in school had earned her recommendations for university study, and she spent her final year of secondary education preparing applications for engineering programs. She approached this process with characteristic thoroughness, researching not just the academic requirements, but the political expectations that would shape her educational experience. The Technical University in Dresden has an excellent reputation, Anna mentioned one evening as we reviewed her application materials. And the city has good cultural opportunities. What kind of cultural opportunities? I asked, recognizing that Anna's choices were rarely arbitrary. Music, Anna said simply. They have a very active student orchestra and several informal musical groups that perform folk songs and classical pieces. I understood the significance of this preference. Music was one of the few areas where personal expression remained relatively unconstrained, where young people could gather for reasons that had nothing to do with political education or career advancement. Anna was choosing a university environment that would provide both excellent technical education and opportunities for the kind of private fulfillment that had become increasingly important to her. Klaus approved of Anna's choice for different reasons. Dresden is a serious city, he said with satisfaction. The students there focus on their studies and their responsibilities. What Klaus meant, I realized, was that Dresden had a reputation for political stability and appropriate attitudes, qualities that would reflect well on Anna's character and, by extension, on our family's reliability. As Anna's final year of school progressed, I watched her manage the increasing pressure of academic expectations, university applications, and the social complexities of being a young person in our world. She handled all of these challenges with remarkable composure, but I also noticed signs of the strain involved in maintaining such careful balance. Anna had developed habits of physical tension, tight shoulders, clenched jaw, hands that moved restlessly when she thought no one was watching. She slept less soundly than she had as a child, and I sometimes heard her moving around her room late at night as if she were too active mentally to rest physically. "Are you feeling anxious about university?" I asked one evening as I noticed her fidgeting with her homework. Anna looked up from her mathematics problems with surprise. "No," she said automatically, then paused and reconsidered. "Well, perhaps a little. There are many things to think about." "What kinds of things?" Anna was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want to make sure I make the right choices. Not just for my studies, but for everything. The friends I make, the activities I join, the way I present myself. Everything will matter more in university." I recognized the weight of responsibility in Anna's words. She understood that her university years would determine not just her professional future, but her entire social position in our world. The relationships she formed, the attitudes she displayed, the choices she made would all become part of her permanent record, influencing every subsequent opportunity. "You've always been good at making thoughtful choices," I reassured her. "But the stakes are higher now," Anna replied. "In school, if I made a mistake, it only affected my grades. In university, mistakes could affect my whole life." This conversation reminded me of similar fears I had felt at Anna's age, though the specific pressures she faced were more complex than those I had navigated. Anna was coming of age in a world where political reliability had become as important as academic competence, where personal relationships carried implications for professional advancement, where private thoughts required constant management to avoid public consequences. The weight of these responsibilities seemed enormous for a 17-year-old, but Anna carried them with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. That spring brought news that initially seemed routine. Klaus had been selected for another promotion, this time to a position at the regional level that would involve coordination between multiple industrial districts. The promotion represented significant recognition of his professional capabilities and political reliability. But Klaus surprised both Anna and me by expressing ambivalence about the opportunity. "It would mean more travel," he said over dinner. "More time away from home, more responsibilities that extend beyond the factory environment." "But it's a significant advancement," I pointed out. "Yes," Klaus agreed, "and it would provide better opportunities for Anna's future, more connections that could be useful for her career development." Anna looked up from her plate with an expression I couldn't interpret. "I don't need special connections," she said quietly. "I prefer to advance based on my own work." Klaus and I both looked at her with surprise. This was the first time Anna had expressed any resistance to the practical benefits that Klaus's position could provide. "Of course you'll advance based on your own work," Klaus said, "but useful connections can provide opportunities to demonstrate your capabilities." Anna nodded politely, but I could see that she remained unconvinced. Later, as I helped her with her evening preparations, I asked about her reaction to Klaus's news. "I just think," Anna said carefully, "that it's better to be known for what you accomplish rather than who you know." "Both can be important," I suggested. "Yes," Anna agreed, "but I want to be sure that what I accomplish is really mine." I understood Anna's concern, She had watched Klaus's career advance through a combination of competence and political positioning, and she was expressing a preference for a more straightforward relationship between effort and reward. It was an idealistic perspective, but also a practical one. Anna had learned that independence required self-reliance, that the fewer favors you owed, the fewer compromises you might be asked to make. Klaus ultimately accepted the promotion, and our household routine adjusted to accommodate his increased travel schedule. He was away 2 or 3 nights each week, attending meetings and conferences that brought together industrial managers from across the region. These absences created a different dynamic between Anna and me. Without Klaus's presence to moderate our conversations, Anna and I began talking more openly about topics we had previously discussed only indirectly. "Do you ever wonder," Anna asked one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, "what it would be like to live somewhere else?" "What kind of somewhere else?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what she meant. "Just somewhere different, where the rules were different, where people could say what they really thought without worrying about consequences." I paused in my dishwashing, considering how to respond to this question. Anna was 18 now, legally an adult, but still my daughter living in my home. The question she was asking was dangerous, but it was also natural for someone her age to wonder about alternatives to the world they had inherited. "I think," I said carefully, "that every place has its own rules, its own ways of managing the relationship between individual desires and collective needs. But some places have more flexibility than others." Anna persisted. "Perhaps," I agreed, "but we live here, and we have to make the best life we can in the circumstances we face." Anna nodded, but I could see that she was still thinking. "Sometimes I wonder if making the best life we can means accepting too many limitations on what that life can include." This was a remarkably sophisticated observation for an 18-year-old. And it suggested that Anna had been thinking seriously about fundamental questions of compromise and accommodation. "What kinds of limitations concern you most?" I asked. Anna was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I worry that I'm becoming too good at saying what people want to hear and not good enough at knowing what I actually think." Her honesty took my breath away. Anna had identified the central challenge of our world: how to maintain authentic selfhood while meeting the requirements for social survival. "I think," I said finally, "that knowing what you actually think is the first step toward protecting it. But what if what I actually think is incompatible with the life I'm supposed to live?" I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and turned to face Anna directly. "Then you have to decide which is more important to you, expressing what you think or living the life you're supposed to live. And if both are important, then you have to find ways to honor both, even if that means living with some contradictions." Anna nodded slowly, "Like you and Papa have done." "Like Papa and I have tried to do," I corrected. "Not always successfully, but we've tried." This conversation marked a new level of honesty in my relationship with Anna. She was no longer a child to be protected from difficult truths, but a young adult who was grappling with the same moral complexities that Klaus and I had navigated for decades. Over the following months, as Anna completed her final year of secondary school and prepared for university, she and I continued these conversations. We talked about the nature of compromise, about the difference between adaptation and surrender, about the ways that private integrity could coexist with public conformity. These discussions were dangerous, but they were also necessary. Anna was about to enter a world where she would face increasing pressure to define herself in relation to political and social expectations. She needed to understand not just how to meet those expectations, but how to maintain some sense of authentic selfhood while doing so. By the spring of 1987, Anna had been accepted to the Technical University in Dresden and was preparing for the transition to independent adult life. She approached this preparation with characteristic thoroughness, but I noticed that she was also making choices that suggested a desire for greater personal autonomy. Anna had decided to live in student housing rather than with a local family, despite Klaus's suggestion that a family arrangement might provide better supervision and support. She had chosen to study mechanical engineering rather than the more politically relevant field of industrial management that Klaus had recommended. She had expressed interest in joining the university orchestra rather than the more prestigious student government organizations. In each case, Anna was choosing options that would provide her with more independence and less political visibility, even when those choices might limit her future advancement opportunities. "I want to focus on my studies," Anna explained when Klaus questioned her residential choice. "I think I'll be less distracted in student housing." "But family housing provides more stability," Klaus argued, "and opportunities to develop relationships with established community members." "I prefer to develop relationships with other students," Anna replied. "People my own age who are facing similar challenges." I could see that Klaus was concerned about Anna's preference for independence over connection, but I also recognized that Anna was making strategic choices based on her understanding of what would serve her best in the long term. Anna wanted to enter university life with as few predetermined obligations as possible, free to make her own assessments of people and opportunities rather than inheriting relationships through Klaus's professional network. It was a wise strategy for someone who valued autonomy, but it was also a rejection of the collaborative approach that had enabled Klaus's success. Anna was choosing a more individualistic path, with both the benefits and risks that such a choice entailed. The summer before Anna left for university was marked by a series of conversations that felt like preparations for a long separation. Klaus and I both understood that Anna's departure represented not just a change in our household, but a fundamental shift in our family dynamics. Anna would return for visits, but she would no longer be subject to our daily influence and protection. She would be making her own choices about friends, activities, and attitudes, managing her own relationships with authority figures, creating her own strategies for navigating social and political expectations. "Remember," Klaus told Anna during one of their final conversations before her departure, "that your behavior reflects not just on you, but on your family. The reputation you build will affect all of us." Anna nodded seriously. "I understand," she said. "I'll be careful to represent our family well." But I could see in Anna's expression that she was also thinking about the reverse relationship, that our behavior would continue to reflect on her, that Klaus's professional activities and my teaching responsibilities would influence how others perceived her character and reliability. Anna was entering university life with the awareness that she was not just an individual student, but a representative of her family's political and social position. This awareness would shape her choices and relationships in ways that she was just beginning to understand. The night before Anna left for Dresden, she came to me with a request that surprised me. "Mama," she said, "I want you to have this." She handed me a small notebook bound in blue cloth that I recognized as her private diary. "Anna, I can't read your diary," I protested. "I'm not asking you to read it," Anna said. "I'm asking you to keep it safe. In case I ever need to remember who I was before I learned to be who I'm supposed to be." I took the notebook, understanding the significance of this gift. Anna was entrusting me with her private thoughts, not for supervision, but for preservation. She was asking me to safeguard her authentic self while she learned to navigate the compromises that adult life would require. "I'll keep it safe," I promised, "and I'll return it whenever you ask." Anna hugged me then, a rare display of physical affection from a young woman who had learned to be careful about emotional expression. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding." The next morning, Klaus and I helped Anna load her belongings into the taxi that would take her to the train station: 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of books, and a small bag of personal items, everything she would need to begin her independent life. As the taxi pulled away from our building on Karl-Marx Street, I watched Anna's face in the rear window until the car turned the corner and disappeared from view. Klaus stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, and we both remained silent for a long moment. "She'll be fine," Klaus said finally. "She's well prepared." "Yes," I agreed. "She's very well prepared." But as we climbed the stairs back to our flat, I thought about what it meant to be well prepared for life in our world. It meant knowing how to adapt, how to compromise, how to maintain private truths while expressing public conformity. It meant learning to live with contradictions, to manage complexity, to navigate between what was said and what was meant. Anna was indeed well prepared for all of this, but I wondered what other kinds of preparation might have been possible in a different world, and what parts of herself Anna might have to sacrifice to maintain the preparation she had received in ours. The autumn of 1989 began like any other autumn. The leaves turned golden brown and fell from the trees in our courtyard. The heating in our building cycled on with its familiar clanking sounds. The street markets displayed their seasonal offerings of root vegetables and preserved goods. Life continued in its careful, measured rhythms as it had for 28 years. But underneath this surface continuity, something had changed. I felt it first as a quality of attention in conversations, a heightened alertness in the way people listened to the news, a new kind of speculation in the whispered exchanges between neighbors. The official media spoke of changes happening in other socialist countries: Hungary opening its borders, Poland holding elections, reform movements in Czechoslovakia. These reports were presented as evidence of flexible responses to local conditions, nothing that would affect our own well-ordered society. But the unofficial conversations, the ones that happened in stairwells and at market queues between trusted friends in private kitchens, suggested that these changes were more significant than official accounts acknowledged. Anna came home for a weekend visit in late September, and I noticed immediately that she seemed different, not in her appearance or manners, but in a quality of suppressed excitement that showed in her gestures and the quickness of her speech. "Dresden is very lively right now," she said over dinner, carefully neutral words that could mean many things. "Lively how?" Klaus asked, his attention sharpening. "Students are discussing the reform movements in other countries," Anna replied. "There's a lot of interest in what's happening elsewhere." "Academic interest, I hope," Klaus said. "The situation in those countries is very complex, and outside observers might not fully understand the local contexts. Anna nodded but didn't reply, and I recognized her silence as a form of communication. She had things to say, but was choosing not to say them, at least not in Klaus's presence. Later that evening, as Anna and I worked together in the kitchen preparing her return journey, she spoke more openly. "Mama, people are starting to talk about possibilities," she said quietly, her back to the door where Klaus was reading in the sitting room, not loudly, not publicly, but in small groups in trusted circles. "People are wondering whether change might be possible here too. What kind of change?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "Change in how we live, how we think, what we can say and do." Anna's voice was still quiet, but carried an intensity I hadn't heard before. Change in whether we have to keep choosing between being honest and being safe. I felt my heart accelerate, a physical response to the dangerous nature of this conversation. "Anna, you have to be very careful about these discussions, the consequences." "I know the consequences, Mama," Anna interrupted gently. "I've been trained my whole life to understand the consequences. But maybe, just maybe, the calculation of consequences is changing." After Anna returned to Dresden, I found myself paying closer attention to the small signs of shifting attitudes that I had previously dismissed or ignored. The increased frequency of gatherings in neighbors' homes, the subtle changes in how people spoke about current events, the slightly longer pauses before people repeated official explanations as if they were considering whether those explanations remained necessary. Klaus had noticed the changes too, but his interpretation was different from mine. "There's a concerning level of undisciplined speculation occurring in some quarters," he mentioned one evening in early October. "People allowing themselves to be influenced by events in other countries that have no relevance to our own situation." "Do you think they have no relevance?" I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. Klaus looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "I think," he said carefully, "that each country must find its own path to progress, and that what works elsewhere might not work here. But what if people here want to try something different anyway?" Klaus was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "People don't always understand what's in their best interest. Sometimes guidance is necessary." This response troubled me more than an overtly authoritarian statement would have. Klaus had internalized the logic of control so thoroughly that he genuinely believed restrictive guidance served people's interests rather than constrained them. I wondered whether Anna's generation, who had learned compliance as children but were questioning it as adults, might see things differently. The answer came sooner than I expected. On November 9th, 1989, I was at home preparing dinner when Klaus called from his office. His voice on the telephone sounded strange, not frightened exactly, but unsettled in a way I had never heard before. "Margot, turn on the television," he said. "Something is happening." I turned on our small television set and watched as the news anchor, speaking with unusual uncertainty, reported on a press conference where an official had announced new regulations for travel to the West. The details were confused, the timing unclear, but the essential message was unmistakable. The barriers were opening. I stood in our kitchen, wooden spoon still in my hand, trying to understand what I was seeing and hearing. Around me, the familiar objects of our daily life, the yellow walls I had painted, the curtains I had mended, the table where we had eaten thousands of meals, seemed suddenly unfamiliar, as if they belonged to a different world than the one I was now inhabiting. From the building around me, I began to hear sounds that were equally unfamiliar. Doors opening, footsteps in hallways, voices calling to neighbors, the unusual activity of people emerging from their private spaces into shared ones. I went to our window and looked down at Karl-Marx-Straße. People were appearing from doorways, standing in small groups, looking toward the sector border that had defined our geography for nearly 3 decades. Some were crying, some were laughing. Most were simply standing in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just heard. Frau Weber emerged from our building entrance and stood on the sidewalk, one hand pressed to her chest. She looked up and saw me at the window, and our eyes met across the distance. Neither of us waved or called out. We simply looked at each other, sharing a moment of understanding that required no words. Klaus arrived home earlier than usual, his face flushed from hurrying. "The streets are filling with people," he said, "everyone heading toward the wall. They're saying the crossings are opening, that guards are letting people through." "Should we go?" I asked. "Should we see it ourselves?" Klaus hesitated, and I could see him struggling with competing impulses. The practical caution that had guided his choices for years urged restraint, observation, waiting to see how events developed. But something else, curiosity, hope, or perhaps just the human desire to witness history, was pulling him toward the unfolding events. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, let's go see." We walked toward the nearest crossing point, joining streams of other people moving in the same direction. The streets were filling with pedestrians, bicycles, even cars, all converging on the places where the wall had stood as an impassable barrier for so long. As we approached the crossing, I could see crowds gathering, people pressing forward tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. The guards, who for years had stood with weapons and authority, now looked uncertain, conferring with each other, consulting papers, making phone calls. And then someone crossed. A young man, perhaps 25, simply walked through the checkpoint. The guards watched, but didn't stop him. He reached the other side, turned back to look at where he had come from, and his face broke into an expression of wonder and disbelief. Others followed, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. People were crossing in both directions, east to west and west to east, moving through the checkpoints that had separated them for nearly 3 decades. I watched this movement with tears streaming down my face, though I wasn't sure whether they were tears of joy or grief, or simply overwhelming emotion that defied simple categorization. Beside me, Klaus stood very still, his hand gripping mine with unusual tightness. "Is this really happening?" I asked him. "I think it is," Klaus replied, his voice barely audible over the growing sounds of celebration around us. "I think everything is changing." We stayed at the crossing point for hours, watching people reunite with family members they hadn't seen in decades, watching strangers embrace each other in shared joy, watching the impossible become real before our eyes. Young people were dancing on top of the wall itself, something that would have resulted in arrest or worse just hours before. Someone had brought a hammer and was chipping away at the concrete, creating small pieces of the barrier to keep as souvenirs. Music was playing from somewhere, and people were singing, not the approved songs of socialist progress, but popular music from both East and West, the kind of music that had existed all along, but in carefully controlled contexts. As midnight approached and the November cold began to penetrate our coats, Klaus and I walked slowly back to our flat on Karl-Marx-Straße. The streets were still full of people, but their movement had changed character. The initial rush toward the wall had given way to a more reflective wandering, people walking through their transformed city as if seeing it for the first time. Back in our flat, everything looked exactly as it had when we left. The yellow walls, the mended curtains, the table set for a dinner we hadn't eaten. But the space felt different, as if the furniture and objects themselves knew that the world they existed in had fundamentally changed. "What happens now?" I asked Klaus as we sat together on our sofa. "I don't know," Klaus admitted. "I genuinely don't know." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. Over the following days and weeks, our lives continued, but in a state of suspended transformation. I still went to my teaching job, but the atmosphere at school had changed dramatically. Teachers spoke more freely in the staff room, questioning policies we had implemented without discussion for years. Students asked different kinds of questions, no longer content with the careful answers we had trained them to accept. Klaus still went to work, but he came home each evening with news of meetings that ended without decisions, policies that were being reconsidered, officials who had suddenly taken leave or been reassigned. The institutional structure that had defined his career was dissolving around him, leaving him uncertain about both his immediate duties and his long-term prospects. Anna called from Dresden with news that the university was in a state of upheaval. "Everything is being discussed," she said, her voice carrying the excitement I had heard in September, but amplified by actual events. "Professors are reconsidering curricula. Students are organizing independent discussion groups. People are saying things in public that they only thought in private before. Are you safe?" I asked, maternal concern overriding my own excitement about these changes. "Yes, Mama, I'm safe," Anna reassured me. "I'm more than safe. I'm finally able to be myself without constantly calculating the consequences." After the call ended, I thought about Anna's words. To be herself without calculating consequences. This was something she had never been able to do in her entire life. She had learned to calculate consequences before she learned to read, had been managing the relationship between authentic thought and appropriate expression since childhood. Now, at 21, she was experiencing a freedom that I had hardly imagined was possible. In December, I walked through our neighborhood and noticed that some residents had begun taking down the official photographs and slogans that had decorated their windows. The images of party leaders, the banners about socialist progress, the carefully crafted displays of political loyalty, all were quietly disappearing, leaving windows that showed only the private lives within. On Karl-Marx Street itself, someone had made an unofficial modification to the street sign, adding a handwritten note, "Soon to be renamed." I didn't know whether this was an act of defiance, hope, or simply observation, but it made me think about that morning in 1961 when I had watched workers change the sign from Friedrichstraße. I had thought then that we would learn to live with the new name, to adapt to the changing geography of our city. And we had learned to adapt to so many things, to accept so many limitations, to live with so many contradictions. But now those adaptations were becoming unnecessary, those limitations were dissolving, those contradictions were being resolved, though in ways that left us uncertain about what would replace them. On Christmas Eve, Klaus and I hosted Anna for what felt like both a traditional celebration and a wake for the life we had known. We prepared our usual meal, roasted duck that Klaus's colleague had secured through unofficial channels, potato dumplings, red cabbage. We decorated our small tree with the same ornaments we had collected over the years. We exchanged modest gifts wrapped in recycled paper. But our conversation ranged over topics we had never discussed so openly. What we had really thought about the government we had lived under, which compromises we regretted and which we considered necessary, what we hoped for in the future that was opening before us. "I'm thinking about resigning from my position," Klaus said quietly, a statement so unexpected that Anna and I both stared at him. "What would you do instead?" I asked. "I don't know yet," Klaus admitted, "but I'm not sure I can continue in a role that was designed to monitor and control people, even if the system that created that role is changing." This was the first time Klaus had explicitly acknowledged the nature of his work, and the first time he had expressed doubt about his participation in it. "Do you regret the choices you made?" Anna asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Klaus considered this question carefully. "I regret some of them," he said finally. "But I also think that I did what seemed necessary to protect you and your mother, to provide stability for our family. I don't know if there were better alternatives available or if I simply didn't see them." "There probably weren't better alternatives," I said, surprising myself by defending choices I had often privately questioned. "We all did what we thought we had to do to survive and to protect each other." Anna nodded slowly. "I understand that," she said, "and I don't blame you for the world I grew up in. But I'm grateful that I get to live in a different world now. One where maybe I won't have to make the same kinds of choices." That night, lying in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of our building settling, I thought about the 28 years we had lived on Karl-Marx Street. The small compromises that had seemed insignificant at the time, but had accumulated into a particular kind of life, the careful silences that had protected us from difficult questions, the adaptation that had enabled survival, but also shaped who we had become. I thought about Anna's diary, still safely hidden in my dresser drawer, a record of thoughts that had been too dangerous to express publicly, but too important to forget entirely. And I thought about the future that was opening before us, uncertain, potentially difficult, but also filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks before. The wall that had divided our city for nearly 3 decades was coming down piece by piece, chunk by chunk, as thousands of people took hammers and chisels to the concrete barrier. But there were other walls too, internal walls we had built to protect ourselves, to manage contradictions, to live with compromises that had seemed necessary at the time. Those walls would be harder to dismantle. They wouldn't fall in a single dramatic night, but would require patient work, honest conversations, and the willingness to examine choices we had made and roles we had played. As I drifted towards sleep, I realized that I was both exhausted by the years we had lived through and strangely hopeful about the years ahead. We had survived, my family and I. We had adapted, compromised, learned to navigate impossible contradictions. We had protected each other as best we could within the constraints we faced. And now perhaps we would have the opportunity to learn how to live differently, not carefully, not strategically, not in constant calculation of consequences, but with the kind of openness and honesty that we had only been able to practice in the privacy of our own thoughts. The house on Karl-Marx Street had witnessed nearly 3 decades of our careful survival. Now it would witness whatever came next, the uncertain, messy, complicated work of learning to live without the walls that had defined us for so long. Outside my window, I could hear the distant sounds of celebration continuing into the night, people still discovering their newfound freedom to cross borders, to speak openly, to imagine different futures. The sounds were joyful but also chaotic, the noise of a world being remade without clear plans or certain outcomes. I pulled the blanket closer and closed my eyes, ready for whatever sleep might bring and whatever tomorrow would require. The wall had come down, but the work of living without it was only beginning.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.